First, I complied. First, I signed. First, I closed my door when they asked me to. They cataloged compliance like an inventory. First, I was cooperative. Then I was helpful. Then I was a contact. And a contact once listed becomes a pattern. They taught me the language of containment. They taught me how to answer. I learned to like the forms. There was an order to everything: boxes, lines, checkboxes, signatures. My handwriting grew tidy under pressure. I initialed received policies with the ease of someone who believes policies will protect them. They handed me a manual on escalation. It was 312 pages of flowcharts and lists. It smelled of glue and a kind of careful optimism. In meetings, I conveyed acquiescence like a practiced actor. Yes, I said into a microphone that never picked up the small tremor in my throat. No, I said when they asked about conflicts, and my no felt boxed, neat, tidy. Cooperation has benefits. It keeps your email active. It keeps your access keys valid. It keeps the forms that allow you to breathe stamped approved. I was polite because the world rewarded politeness. I learned how to couch questions as curiosity. I learned to put "for clarity" at the top of every request. When anomalies first appeared, I approached them the way a librarian approaches a misshelved book. There was an invoice that misaligned dates. There was a name on a shipping manifest that did not match any employee ID. There were ledgers whose totals would not reconcile if you rounded in a particular way. I filed tickets. I sent polite procedural emails with subject lines like "Request for clarification." I attached screenshots and logs, and I wrote the dates in full to avoid ambiguity. No alarm bells rang. A reply arrived. Noted, see me later. Later is a word dressed in goodwill. It can mean concern. It can mean a request for patience. It can also be the hinge on a door you didn't know was closing. They asked about my sleep. They asked whether I had been under stress. They offered mindfulness modules and wellness webinars with soothing titles. It is easy to accept help. Humane offers arrive with polite calendars. They come with links and disclaimers and the right amount of empathy. I attended the sessions. I filled out the forms. I wrote truthfully that I slept poorly and sometimes felt anxious for reasons I could not name. That was enough. Soon I was in a file folder with a flag. Not a red flag. A small discreet red dot near my name. Once there is a dot, the machinery of containment finds its rhythm. Calendars change. Invitations omit you. Shared drives acquire new permission layers that your requests for access never clear. It is almost perfunctory. Someone CCs a manager and then deletes the thread. Someone schedules a meeting and puts no attendees in the booking. Someone in procurement copies another person on correspondence, then the copy disappears from the saved record. I noticed. Not as a drama, but as a pattern. I printed logs. I took timestamps with my phone so I could show exact seconds if needed. I typed notes in the margins of my notebook. Who said what tone, which door closed after which phrase. Then one morning, an automated message slid into my inbox with the pleasant, efficient subject line, "Confirm, well-being check." The message asked me to reply, "Confirm you are okay." It gave multiple choice answers, yes/prefer to discuss/not right now. I clicked yes. The reply felt thin as tissue paper under the stamp of procedure. A day later, another message. "Confirm, daily well-being check." Twice on the same day, a morning reminder, an afternoon repeat. The tone was the same, neutral, helpful, almost intimate in its efficiency. I pressed yes again. The clicks made me feel like an animal pressing a lever. The confirmations multiplied. They came by email, by message, by an app notification that liked to appear at the exact second a meeting began. Confirm you are okay. Confirm you are present. Confirm you have received this policy update. Each confirm was a small ritual. Each ritual carves a groove. At first, the confirmations felt like safety checks. A daily vetting, a warm hand on the shoulder. They told us they loved transparency. They told us confirmation improved well-being statistics. Metrics were shared in cheerful graphs in the monthly newsletter with pastel bars and reassuring captions, engagement up 12%. I complied because resisting felt like being marked. I complied because the chain of approvals unblocked things I needed: travel, reimbursements, my ability to speak at a seminar. I complied because every compliance left a receipt. Receipts formed a trail. Trails become a map. Maps breed routes. Confirm once. Are you okay? Confirm twice. Are you sure? Confirm daily. Please confirm you are still okay. Confirm hourly. Please confirm you are at your workstation. Confirm continuously. The app that required a heartbeat check to remain open. They taught us the gentle bureaucratic verbs. To acknowledge was to accept. To confirm was to be present. To validate was to remain. The verbs folded into daily life like paper into an envelope. I began to say them aloud in the shower to hear the sound of authority soften. I acknowledge, I confirm, I validate. The first week passed with an air of novelty. People joked about the new check-ins in the break room. We shared screenshots of cheerful checkboxes and the tiny rewards, badges for daily confirmations, 7 out of 7, that appeared under our internal profiles like merit ribbons. The badges were aesthetic, polished. They pleased a human part of us that still liked being noticed. Then the messages changed shape. The phrasing was the same, but the context shifted. A confirmation request arrived on a day when I had a doctor's appointment. It asked me to confirm the appointment time, which I had already confirmed with the medical office. I answered yes. The system followed up. Please confirm you took prescribed medication. I felt a small, cold prickle in my skin. I deleted the message and then opened it again. The message's language was careful, the font humane. It asked for details. Which medication? How often did I experience side effects? I answered as if filling out the same tidy form that had taught me how to be neat. I clicked submit. The next week, a security clearance required a confirmation of contacts. I listed the names I was comfortable listing. The system asked for phone numbers. It asked for relationships. My older brother's name went in the field labeled emergency contact. My brother called later to ask me if I had changed jobs. I had not. Why would they need that? He asked. They said it's procedure, I answered. They said it's for your safety, he said. I heard the sentence and realized how easily safety and surveillance borrow each other's language. As confirmations increased, so did the scripts that followed. Miss a confirmation and an automated escalation would fire off, a gentle reminder, then a second reminder, then a meek call from someone whose tone was practiced in compassion and whose words were thinly veiled with policy. We noticed you haven't confirmed today. Is everything okay? When you answered no, the next message contained a calendar invite for a check-in. Check-ins are meetings that make contingency a ritual. They sit in your calendar like small, inevitable storms. Their agendas are short and their effect is long. In the check-in, you learn the taxonomy of your attention. You learn what low risk looks like on a spreadsheet. You learn what requires monitoring means in the voice of a manager who prefers to keep tones flat. I answered yes, more than I admitted to myself. I answered yes when the nights had been fractal with worry. I answered yes when access to a gateway required a run of green checkmarks. Each yes built a ledger entry: time, date, device, IP. The ledger became proof of normalcy. Gradually, the confirmations migrated from screens into other spaces. At the office reception, a kiosk asked visitors to confirm their purpose and to have their photo taken. The cafeteria sign-in tablet asked the staff to confirm they had taken the designated break. Even the small potted plant near the meeting room was tagged with an NFC sticker that, when tapped, logged an attendance presence. The requests learned our routines faster than we learned to avoid them. They could anticipate when you would forget to confirm, and they placed a notification just then. They learned to sound like help. They learned which phrases made you click without thinking. At night, the phone would buzz with a confirm while I was in the small, vulnerable dark of my kitchen, chopping an onion, thinking about nothing of consequence. I would stand with the knife in my hand and press the button. Sometimes the message would be an invitation to a micro-survey. Rate your stress level 1 to 5. Sometimes it would be a gentle prompt. We noticed reduced engagement. Would you like a suggestion? I found myself calibrating my answers to the incentives the confirmations offered. If I answered 2 on stress, the system recommended meditation microsessions and gave me a small badge. If I answered 5, a human-sounding voice recommended an immediate call. I began to learn the soft math of responses. I learned which admissions would trigger conversation and which would keep me in the tidy, approved lane. It was a game and a trap. You could win small comforts, extended deadlines, a better travel reimbursement rate, a manager's empathy, by staying on the right side of the confirmation curve. But the more you played, the more the game defined what countable life looked like. A week became a litany of confirmations: morning, noon, evening. The app asked me at 1 hour and then again at 55 minutes later, "Are you working? Are you present?" In the end, it did not much matter what I wrote. The act of answering created a record that could be cited later. There were moments of resistance. Once I ignored a confirmation for an entire day. The day passed quiet and unremarkable. The following morning, an escalation landed. A sternly worded email from a compliance officer requesting an explanation. I wrote back, "I was offline for medical reasons." I attached a note from a doctor. The reply was prompt. "Noted. Please confirm daily for the next 2 weeks." 2 weeks of confirmations felt longer than the 2 weeks had any right to. It turned my life into an exercise in gentle vigilance. I learned to script my days to forestall the extra questions. If I was going to a funeral, I scheduled it between scheduled check-ins. If I needed to take time for an appointment, I built a buffer of extra affirmations beforehand. Conversations with friends tightened. "Did you confirm this morning?" they'd ask across the table. "I did," I would say. The question itself became a greeting. We started to treat each other like nodes on a network whose uptime mattered. The confirmations taught us not just to answer, but to anticipate. They taught us to be preemptive, to take small, prophylactic acts of compliance before any request could be made. We would send polite check-ins to our own managers, confirming I'm fine. These self-confirmations were both armor and confession. The system's definitions of wellness bent to what was quantifiable. Sleep hours, meeting attendance, response times. Kindness, nuance, private grief, these were harder to put into fields. So we converted the messy human things into proxies. Did you open the suggested link? Did you download the workbook? The proxies worked for the graphs. One morning, while the city outside made its clumsy sound of traffic and winter, I received a message that asked me to confirm something that felt new. "Confirm receipt of notice regarding travel restrictions," it said. I had not planned travel. I clicked Confirm. A follow-up requested confirmation of planned destinations in the next 6 months. I listed nothing. Days later, my manager asked to touch base. The touch base was a conversation that moved from mundane tasks to my social circle. "Who did you see last month?" she asked, with the clinical curiosity of someone auditing a supply chain. I named 3 people. She took notes. We learned to treat our acquaintances like components on a schematic, essential, traceable, to be accounted for. That language invaded the margins of life. At dinner we asked, "Who are your contact points?" In the elevator someone asked, "Have you confirmed your contacts this week?" The world had become a set of nodes we were obliged to keep lit. The confirmations started to preserve people in categories: helpful, cooperative, low risk, monitor. These labels rounded the edges of a person into a shape the system could store. In my profile, the tags grew like lichen. A manager once joked, poorly, about keeping our contacts tidy. The joke landed with a silence that smelled like something folded away. There were procedural answers to many of the things we experienced, but their application varied depending on whether someone was on the right side of the ledger. If your confirmations were consistent, your anomalies were met with a human touch. If your confirmations wavered, often the first sign was administrative friction, delays, requests for additional verification, a sudden need to re-upload identification. These frictions felt like small pins inserted into a calendar until the shape of your life was a stitched pattern of approvals and exceptions. A woman in my cohort failed to confirm for 3 days when she had to care for an ailing parent. The system labeled her "requires monitoring." Meetings were scheduled. A social worker from the provider partner called and asked gentle questions with a crispness that did not match her tone. Later, the woman told me she had removed the app. She said, "It felt like they were reaching into my life and taking photos." I understood. It is one thing to send a report. It is another to be watched as you send it. The confirmations promised care. They delivered trace. Oh, trace is evidence. Evidence becomes a reference. Reference becomes control. We adapted. There were strategies. I learned to answer in neutral tones. I learned to build a buffer of confirmations before any long absence. I learned to root my life around the pulses of the app. It was a way to live without being repeatedly asked why you had lived that way. Yet habits erode differently than we expect. One evening, after a long day of meetings, I received a confirmation. "Please confirm you are alone at home." The phrasing was clinical. The request felt private. I paused. I wondered who had decided this question and why it needed answering. I answered yes, and then I closed my laptop and walked to the window. Outside, the streetlight pooled like a watchful eye. The question echoed in my head, and I realized the confirm had become a way to make an invisible institution present in the small corners of my evening. Language shifted around me. Where once we would say, "I'm fine," as a private assurance, we now said, "I confirmed." Where once the answer to "How are you?" required nuance, the new scripts rewarded a single checkbox. Our conversations flattened into data points as easily as a pressed flower. The confirmations were written to sound like mercy. "We are here to support you," they said. But mercy that must be proven every morning becomes a condition rather than a gift. It teaches you to negotiate your own vulnerability for acceptance. I started to mark what I would not confirm. Small rebellions, not answering a question about who I spent time with, refusing to log a brief sacred walk, not responding to the hourly "Are you present?" ping. The cost was tangible. Minor delays in reimbursement. Extra steps to regain permissions. But each small friction was also a reminder that the ledger could be gamed against you. The ledger is patient. It waits until you need something and then remembers every small omission. In a town not far away, a policy change arrived that made confirmations mandatory for all external communications. Freelancers were required to confirm their availability before pitching. Consultants had to confirm that they had read the non-disclosure clause before sending invoices. The world adjusted its vocabulary. Confirm began to precede everything that mattered. I began to dream in forms. In sleep, I would answer an endless questionnaire. Morning would come and I would find my thumb hovering over the confirm button before my coffee. There is a fatigue that comes from being legible all the time. It colors your days like a film filter. And then, one afternoon, a small, simple confirmation asked me for something that no checkbox could properly hold. Confirm that you remember who you are. The interface had no field for that kind of answer. I stared at the screen. I typed a reply that the app did not expect. I am more than a series of confirmations. The reply came not from an algorithm, but from a person. A manager I had not spoken to in months wrote, "Thank you for that. Let's talk." We spoke for an hour in a tone that was not scripted. There, in the space between the lines, there was a language that had nothing to do with ticking boxes. That conversation reminded me of the other possibility, that confirmations could be a tool for care if wielded by people who remember that care is not the same as surveillance. It is tender to ask after another and easier to reduce tenderness to a form. But forms do not have to be desserts. They can be bridges when the people on the other end choose to cross them with compassion. I started to keep small records for myself that no one asked for. A private notebook where I wrote full sentences about how my day had felt. I wrote about trivial joys and small terrors. I wrote because I wanted to preserve a shape of myself that was not reducible to a green checkmark. Slowly, the culture around confirmations began to shift in subtle ways. Colleagues began to share notes that were longer than a single checkbox. We began to meet for coffee and to ask, "Are you okay?" without an app in between. We taught one another to be present for the messy answers. Yet systems are durable. The confirmations kept coming. They adapted to the tiny cracks we left open. For every handshake made over a table, there was still an algorithm that wanted an itemized receipt. We lived simultaneously in the human space of a shared cup of coffee and the ledger space of 1,000 daytime yes clicks. I learned to hold both without collapsing. I learned to answer what needed answering and to refuse what felt like theft. I learned to mark the margins of my day with sentences that could not be summarized under a tag. I walked at dusk, I would write. I called my mother. I froze this morning and then kept going. Sometimes I still clicked yes out of habit. Sometimes I answered the way the system wanted me to answer because the cost of a no was too high. But I also started to practice a different kind of confirmation, the one you make when you look at yourself and say, plainly, "I remember who I am." That kind of confirming is quiet and slow and does not need an app. They had asked me to confirm once. Then, every day. At first, the confirmations were small and seemed to ask only for courtesy. Over time, they became a grammar for how my life was recorded and measured. But even in a world that measures you in checkboxes, there are places that remain unmeasured. There are sentences that refuse to be compressed. There is a kind of stubborn interiority that no ledger can annex. When you are asked, and asked again, and asked yet again, you learn the taste of the asking. It has the texture of a form, the cadence of a reminder, the persistence of a soft knock at any hour. You learn how to answer with care, with strategy, with dignity. And you learn perhaps to keep some confirmations sacred, the ones you give to yourself, the long and full answers you write in a private journal, the names you speak aloud so that they will remember you as you remembered them. In the end, the question of confirmation is not a question of technology alone. It is a question of people. Who asks, and why? Who listens, and to what measure of attention? Forms can hold care, or they can hold cages. We learned to read the difference in the tone of a calendar invite. I kept my badge for a long time and wore it like a talisman against the soft insistence of the world. I kept my notebooks for longer. Sometimes I opened them and read what I had written in the small hours, confessions, complaints, the catalogue of a small day's griefs and joys. The ledger never saw those lines. That was my choice. They had asked me to confirm once. Then every day. I answered sometimes for convenience, sometimes for safety, sometimes out of a habit that felt like obedience. But I also learned to answer in ways that preserved the inside of me. To reserve a part that required no proof. To hold the private sentence, I am here, even when no one clicks the box. They kept inventing confirmations in smaller, stranger shapes. A prompt to confirm your commute. A prompt to confirm you had lunch. A prompt to confirm that you had not been bullied on a particular channel. Each one felt reasonable in isolation. Together they suggested a life broken into intervals a machine could count. Sometimes a confirmation would arrive mid-conversation, a polite intrusion that asked to be answered while you split your attention. You could be laughing with a colleague about a shared mistake and the phone would demand, "Confirm you are engaged in team building." The laughter would pause, an awkward seam. We learned to laugh around the edges of the system, to fill silences with the kinds of small talk that would not appear suspicious in a log. The confirmations favored the visible. They rewarded attendance over insight, punctuality over thoughtfulness, presence over patience. The brave, slow work of thinking, of sitting with complexity and letting answers take shape, was harder to fit into a checkbox. We began to mistrust the quiet moments as much as we mistrusted loud ones. We devised rituals to survive the inbox. One friend kept a small printed card under her keyboard with a list of neutral responses she considered safe. Acknowledged, received, will follow up. Another crafted tiny scripts to paste into the confirmation fields that read like small poems of compliance. They read better when she whispered them. At times, the confirmations performed love by accident. A note that asked me to confirm my well-being coincided with a day I had fallen apart over a trivial thing in the shower. The message sent me to a human advisor who listened, formally and with kindness, and who then nudged a manager to rearrange a deadline. In that instant, the ledger had bent toward care, and the care felt like a small, ineffable rescue. But the line between rescue and registry is thin. A rescue that leaves a mark can become a record of vulnerability. Records are durable. They can be called up when convenient. They can harden into policy. I found myself wondering about the future uses of a day's confession. Who might read it 5 years hence, and what conclusions would it make from my few words? A kind of economy emerged around confirmations. Confirmations bought favors and freedoms. A pattern of green checkmarks could be cashed in for trust. A string of missed confirmations could be taxed with oversight. We began to budget our candor. We learned to spend our admissions wisely. There were darker uses too. Once, a vendor asked our team to confirm that a subcontractor's staff had been briefed on a clause that changed their working conditions. The clause was complex and harmed a small set of people who had little recourse. The confirm button made the harm administrable. It converted consent into a checkbox, and with that conversion, the moral residue of complicity felt strangely thin. I started to notice how confirmations favored those with time and privilege. If you had flexible hours, you could answer during calm moments. If you had help at home, you could schedule your day to avoid intrusive pings. If you were already well connected, you would have people advocating for you when an escalation occurred. For others, the system became a trap of endless verifications, each one a hurdle to the things that matter. We began to speak of confirmations not just as tools, but as grammar. Grammar tells you what can be said and how. Confirmations told us which truths were legible, which feelings were admissible. They taught us to record the easy facts and to hide the complicated ones. An engineer on the team wrote a program to summarize my confirmations into a monthly digest. It showed my average response time and the times I had chosen prefer to discuss. It flagged a cluster of late-night confirmations for closer review. I read the digest and felt exposed as if a stranger had taken my life and reduced it to a bar chart. Sometimes the confirmations were used to mediate power. A manager could, with a line in a report, show compliance as evidence of loyalty. They could point to a table showing team confirmation rates and infer dedication, or the reverse. The data could be wielded in performance reviews, in decisions about who to promote, in judgments about who to trust with sensitive work. I learned the small skill of reading the tone behind the confirmations. Some were perfunctory, sent because the system said to send them. Some carried warmth, a supervisor who added a sentence, "Take the afternoon if you need." Some were strategic, written to establish a record in case questions came later. Reading tones became as important as writing answers. Resistance took many shapes. There was the quiet refusal, a day when I ignored a reminder and let the escalation land. There was the public critique, an open email from someone who called the system a machine that mistakes visibility for care. There was also the collective action that surprised us, an informal agreement among a team to limit confirmations to essentials, to protect the margins of private time. The agreement was small, almost ceremonial, and it felt like a shared secret against an indifferent ledger. Once, we staged a different experiment. We decided to answer with more truth than the fields expected. When the app asked, "Are you okay?" we answered with single sentences, "I am tired and grieving. I am worried about my visa." The answers arrived like stones thrown into a still pond. The ripples reached places the rigid tags could not touch. The responses prompted different reactions. Some managers were startled and then moved to real help. Some parts of the system auto-flagged the replies and created extra paperwork. The replies were messy but honest. They taught the system something its creators had not intended, that the shape of an answer could demand a different kind of listening. In time, I began to see confirmations as negotiation, not obedience. Each reply asked silently for something in return. A moment of understanding, a rearranged deadline, a quiet acknowledgement that we had limits. When those returns happened, the confirmations felt reciprocal. When they did not, the confirm button felt like a toll gate. There were losses we could not put back into boxes. A colleague lost a mother and had to choose between grieving and maintaining a spotless confirmation record. She chose grief. The ledger noted the lapse and later cited inconsistent confirmations in a cold performance review. Administrative rationality can be as unforgiving as fate. And yet, small mercies persisted. A neighbor who saw me miss a confirmation sent a message. "Lunch?" A friend brought soup. Human things that do not want receipts found their way through the cracks. These acts did not erase the ledger, but they rebalanced its weight with things that could not be counted. I practiced other tactics of preservation. I scheduled no confirmation times where my device would be off. I wrote longer emails that required reading, and in them I put sentences that mattered. I met friends without phones. I learned to let certain questions drop into silence, and to be okay with the silence. There is a strange tenderness in choosing how to show up. To confirm is to offer a small piece of yourself, and to ask for a small piece of life back. To refuse is to hold the thing closer, to keep it from being catalogued. Both acts are claims. Both are necessary. In the end, the ledger was only a tool. The question we faced was how to make tools serve us rather than the other way around. We insisted that confirmations be paired with conversations, that flagged records bring human contact before consequences. We asked that the data be used to help rather than to punish. Those requests were small governance acts, built from meetings and memos and persistent plain language. Some things changed. A policy was rewritten to limit mandatory confirmations to scenarios where safety was demonstrably at stake. An oversight committee was formed that included people who had once been only passive subjects of the system. We did not win every fight. But we built spaces where the ledger bowed, if only a little, to human judgment. And still, when the phone lit with a small request, "Please confirm you are okay," I sometimes felt the old reflex and answered quickly. At other times I sat with the prompt and wrote something longer, a line or two of truth, the name of a person I loved, the detail of a tiny victory. Those answers were not always neat. They were sometimes useless for an algorithm. But they kept certain parts of me safe from being translated. They first asked me to confirm once. Then every day. Then in the margins of meetings and in the quiet of my kitchen. The confirmations shaped much of the life we lived. But they did not finally define it. There were still pages of my life that resisted the fields, the phone calls at midnight that were too human for a tag, the walks I took to think, the sentences I wrote and never showed anyone. I kept confirming, sometimes dutifully, sometimes defiantly. And in between the clicks I kept other confirmations for myself, private, unlogged, and honest. I would say aloud, sometimes, to no one, and to the small room I had carved out from the ledger's reach, "I am here, I remember, I will keep remembering."